November 1st, 1943, 2:15 in the morning. The North Atlantic, a wave 30 feet high, crashes over the bow of the USS Borie, sending freezing spray across the deck, where men crouch behind gun shields, barely able to see through the darkness and salt. The old destroyer shudders, her aged hull groaning against the swells, and then the searchlight snaps on, cutting through the black chaos of the sea, and there it is. Not 300 yards away, surfaced and running, a German submarine, U-405. The light catches its conning tower, the white spray breaking over its deck, the figures of German sailors scrambling toward their deck gun. What happens next should be impossible. Within minutes, the American destroyer will physically crash into the submarine. The two vessels will become locked together, wedged at an angle in the freezing seas, grinding against each other as waves wash over both. And then something will happen that has not occurred in naval warfare for over a century. The crews will fight hand to hand. American sailors will fire Thompson submachine guns and pistols point blank into German faces. Germans will shoot back with Lugers and machine pistols. Men will hurl shell casings, coffee mugs, knives, anything within reach. One American will kill a German with a sheath knife. The battle will rage for nearly an hour, while both vessels slowly tear each other apart. By dawn, both ships will be sinking. This is the story of the most savage surface engagement of the Battle of the Atlantic. A night of chaos and courage that ended with a destroyer sacrificing itself to kill a single submarine and a crew that fought with weapons their navy never trained them to use. This is the ramming of U-405. The autumn of 1943 marked a turning point in the longest continuous military campaign of the Second World War. For 4 brutal years, German U-boats had been bleeding the Atlantic lifeline between America and Britain, sinking millions of tons of shipping, threatening to starve the island nation into submission. The numbers were staggering. In 1942 alone, German submarines had sent over 6 million tons of Allied shipping to the bottom, roughly 1,400 vessels. Tankers loaded with fuel, freighters carrying tanks and aircraft, troop ships filled with soldiers who would never reach the fight. At its peak, in the spring of '43, the Kriegsmarine was sinking Allied vessels faster than the combined shipyards of America, Britain, and Canada could replace them. Winston Churchill would later admit that the U-boat threat was the only thing during the entire war that truly frightened him. Not the Luftwaffe, not the Wehrmacht, the submarines. The mathematics were terrifying. Britain imported 55 million tons of food, fuel, and raw materials every year. Without that flow, the factories would stop, the military would starve, the war would be lost before America could bring its industrial might to bear. Every convoy that sailed was a gamble. Every torpedo that struck home pushed the Allies closer to catastrophe. But by autumn of '43, the balance had finally, painfully, begun to shift. New technologies emerged from laboratories on both sides of the Atlantic. Centimetric radar, so precise it could detect a submarine's periscope at ranges that seemed impossible a year earlier. High-frequency direction finding, which the sailors called __0__0__, capable of pinpointing a U-boat the moment it transmitted to headquarters. Lee lights, blinding searchlights mounted on aircraft, turning the night that had protected submarines into a killing ground. More importantly, the Allies had finally cracked the German naval enigma codes with enough consistency to route convoys around known Wolfpack positions. The intelligence officers at Bletchley Park, working in absolute secrecy, were reading German submarine orders almost as quickly as the U-boat commanders themselves. Long-range patrol aircraft now covered the mid-Atlantic gap where submarines had once operated with impunity. B-24 Liberators and short Sunderlands prowled hundreds of miles from land, forcing U-boats to stay submerged during the day when they needed to run on the surface to recharge their batteries. Escort carriers, small flat tops converted from merchant hulls, brought air power directly to the convoy routes. Hunter-killer groups prowled the seas, seeking out U-boats before they could reach their targets. The Germans were losing the battle. In May of '43, they had lost 41 submarines in a single month. Dönitz had been forced to withdraw his boats from the North Atlantic entirely, a tactical retreat that felt like defeat. But they had not stopped fighting. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, refused to accept that the battle was lost. He ordered new technologies rushed into production. Acoustic torpedoes that homed on propeller noise, snorkel breathing tubes that allowed submarines to run their diesels while submerged. He equipped his boats with enhanced anti-aircraft armament, quad 20mm mounts that could throw up a wall of fire against attacking aircraft, and he changed tactics. In October '43, Dönitz ordered his submarines to fight back against aircraft on the surface rather than diving to escape. Stay up, shoot back, make the Allied pilots pay for every attack run. He sent them out in groups. He demanded aggression. The result was a new phase of the battle, one characterized not by stealthy ambushes, but by violent surface confrontations. U-boats that once slipped away into the deep now stood and fought. Aircraft that once had easy kills now faced concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The losses on both sides mounted. Into this crucible sailed the USS Card, an escort carrier converted from a merchant hull, and her screen of aging destroyers. Task Group 21.14E. Their mission was simple in concept and brutal in execution. Find U-boats and kill them, sweep the transit routes, protect the convoys, make the North Atlantic too dangerous for German submarines to operate. Among the screening vessels was the Borie. The problem facing both commanders that night was as old as naval warfare itself, but it had taken on new and terrifying dimensions in the age of submarines. Destroyers were designed to find and kill submarines. That was their purpose, their reason for existing. But the weapons they carried were designed for a specific scenario: detecting a submerged enemy with sonar and dropping depth charges to crush its pressure hull. The entire tactical doctrine assumed that the submarine would try to hide, would try to escape into the depths, where guns and torpedoes could not reach it. But what happened when a submarine refused to dive? What happened when a U-boat commander decided to stay on the surface and fight it out? The normal method suddenly became inadequate. Depth charges were useless against a surface target. Torpedoes, the destroyer's most powerful weapon, were too slow and too valuable to waste on a maneuvering surface contact. That left guns, and here the destroyer had a theoretical advantage in firepower. But theory and practice were very different things in heavy seas at night. A submarine was a small target, barely visible above the waves even in daylight. At night, in 30-foot swells, with spray flying and the ship pitching unpredictably, hitting anything was more luck than skill. And the submarine could shoot back. Modern U-boats carried anti-aircraft guns that were just as deadly against surface targets, weapons that had been added specifically to fight back against the aircraft that were killing so many of their sisters. The engagement became a knife fight in a dark room, both opponents slashing blindly, hoping to land a killing blow before the other did. There was another problem, one that the officers aboard Borie understood with uncomfortable clarity. Their ship was old. She was desperately, almost embarrassingly old. A Clemson-class destroyer built in 1920, launched just 2 years after the First World War ended. She had been designed for a different war, a different navy, a different era. Her 4 tall smokestacks marked her as a relic, a four-piper from the days when destroyers burned coal and admirals still argued about whether aircraft would ever threaten battleships. The Clemson class had been the largest class of destroyers ever built by any navy, 156 ships constructed in a furious burst of wartime production. But that had been a quarter century ago. By 1943, most of her sisters had been scrapped, converted to high-speed transports, or handed over to the British under Lend-Lease. The ones that remained in service were there because the war demanded ships. Any ships. The Navy was building new destroyers as fast as the shipyards could turn them out, but there were never enough to cover every convoy, every task group, every operation. So the old four pipers kept sailing, their elderly hulls straining against Atlantic swells their designers had never imagined, their crews trying to fight a modern war with machinery that remembered Woodrow Wilson. Borie displaced 1,260 tons. Her top speed was 35 knots when her aging boilers cooperated, which was increasingly rare. She carried four 4-inch guns, a caliber that had been adequate in 1918, but was marginal against modern targets. She had torpedo tubes she would almost certainly never use, the torpedoes having been removed months earlier to make room for additional depth charge storage. She carried depth charges racked along her stern and in projectors amidships, her primary weapons against the enemy she was designed to hunt. Her crew numbered 163 men. They lived in conditions that ranged from uncomfortable to miserable. The old destroyer had never been designed for extended Atlantic service. Her compartments were cramped, her ventilation inadequate, her insulation minimal. In winter weather, condensation froze on the interior bulkheads. Men slept in damp bunks and wore their clothes for days at a time because nothing ever dried. The ship rolled viciously in any kind of sea state, making hot food a memory and sleep a challenge. They were tired, cold, and frustrated, and they wanted a kill. Her captain was Lieutenant Commander Charles Hutchins. Hutchins was 31 years old, a Naval Academy graduate from the class of '34. He had the lean, angular look of an officer who didn't sleep enough, with dark circles under his eyes and a habit of clenching his jaw when he was thinking. There was a quiet intensity about him, the kind of focused energy that made enlisted men straighten up when he walked past. He understood that his ship was outmatched by nearly every enemy vessel she might encounter, and he had made it his mission to compensate for her weaknesses with the only advantage he could control: his crew's readiness. Hutchins had taken command of the Borie in May of '43, inheriting a ship that should have been retired a decade earlier, and a crew that ranged from seasoned chief petty officers with 20 years of service to teenagers on their first cruise who had been in high school 6 months before. His executive officer was Lieutenant Morrison Brown, a steady presence who handled the administrative burden, while Hutchins focused on tactics. His gunnery officer was Lieutenant Philip Brown, no relation, a detail-oriented perfectionist who had drilled the gun crews until they could load, aim, and fire in their sleep. Hutchins trained them relentlessly. He held gunnery drills in every weather condition, including the kind of North Atlantic storms that made most captains secure the ship and wait for calmer seas. He practiced depth charge attacks at every opportunity, timing the runs with a stopwatch, demanding that the crew shave seconds off their response time. He ran damage control drills until his men could shore up a flooding compartment in total darkness by feel alone. He knew his ship was old and slow and fragile. He knew her boilers were unreliable, her hull was weakening, her guns were obsolescent. He knew that if they encountered a determined enemy in the right conditions, they might not survive. And he knew the only thing that might keep her alive was his crew's ability to fight harder and faster and more savagely than anyone expected. On the night of October 31st, 1943, that training would be tested beyond anything he had imagined. The Card Group was operating 600 miles southwest of Iceland, in waters that Allied intelligence had identified as a transit corridor for U-boats returning from or departing to patrol stations. It was a hunting ground that the task group had prowled for weeks, vectoring aircraft to radar contacts, dropping depth charges on sonar echoes, occasionally catching a submarine on the surface and sending it to the bottom. The returns were good. Card's aircraft and escorts had already sunk several U-boats on this cruise, including one spectacular daylight attack that had left a submarine burning on the surface while its crew abandoned ship. The task group was gaining a reputation as one of the most effective U-boat killers in the Atlantic. The men aboard took a grim satisfaction in the work. The weather that night was deteriorating. The barometer had been dropping all day, and by nightfall, the swells were building to 20 feet, with more to come. The wind was gusting to 30 knots from the northwest, driving spray across the decks of every ship in the formation. The sky was overcast, but the cloud layer was ragged, with gaps that intermittently allowed moon and starlight to illuminate the heaving sea. The effect was disorienting, patches of near-total darkness, alternating with moments of silvery visibility that made shadows seem to move. All hands were at modified battle stations, ready to respond to any contact, but given permission to rest at their positions. The radar operators hunched over their scopes, watching the green sweep for anything that shouldn't be there. The lookouts strained their eyes against the darkness, seeing mostly spray and imagination. At 21:52, approximately 10 o'clock at night, a radar contact appeared on the card scope, bearing 025, range 8 miles. The contact was moving on the surface, making approximately 10 knots. The profile was small, low to the water, not a ship. The radar operator knew immediately what he was looking at. The contact was consistent with a surfaced submarine, card-scrambled aircraft. 2 TBF Avengers lifted off the pitching deck, their pilots fighting to gain altitude in the gusting winds. They turned toward the bearings, searching for the contact with their own radar sets. But the weather was too rough for effective night operations. The air turbulence threw the aircraft around. The radar returns were cluttered with sea echoes. The submarine, if that was what it was, had either dived or slipped away. The planes returned to card without contact, but the task group commander knew the submarine was still out there. A U-boat didn't just vanish. It was either submerged, hiding from the aircraft, or running on the surface somewhere nearby, taking advantage of the weather to mask its radar signature. The order went to the screening destroyers: find the U-boat and sink it. Borie was closest to the original contact bearing. Hutchins ordered flank speed. The old destroyer surged forward, her bow climbing the swells and then crashing down in explosions of spray. Engine room telegraphs jangled. The boilers strained to deliver steam to turbines that were older than most of the men operating them. The ship vibrated with the effort, every rivet and plate protesting the abuse. For the next 4 hours, the chase unfolded across the darkened Atlantic. Borie's radar operators tracked the contact, lost it, regained it, lost it again. The submarine seemed aware it was being hunted, zigzagging through the swells, taking advantage of sea clutter to disappear from the screens. Every time the operators thought they had a solid fix, the return would fade into the noise of wave echoes, leaving them staring at an empty scope. Modern radar was a miracle, but it had limitations. The SG radar that Borie carried could detect a surfaced submarine under good conditions at ranges of 10 miles or more. But these were not good conditions. The heavy swells created false returns that looked almost identical to real contacts. The submarine commander, whoever he was, understood how to use the sea to hide. Twice Hutchins ordered depth charge attacks on suspected positions. The destroyer raced over the coordinates, her stern crew rolling charges into the water, the projectors firing patterns to either side. The charges sank through the darkness, their pressure fuses ticking down the depth, and then detonated in massive underwater explosions that sent geysers of white water climbing into the night. Twice, the charges exploded uselessly. The submarine had already moved. Hutchins paced the bridge, coffee cold in his hand, watching the radar repeater and the darkness beyond the windows. His officers came and went with reports. Fuel consumption, boiler status, crew condition. Of the same facts repeated with minor variations. The Germans were good. They had been fighting this war for 4 years, surviving when so many of their comrades had not. They knew every trick of the radar, every way to use the sea state and the weather to break contact. They knew how to use the sea, but Hutchins was patient and his crew was angry. The men aboard Borie had seen the photographs of torpedoed merchant ships, the oil-covered survivors pulled from the water, the bodies floating in life jackets. They had read the reports of ships sunk with all hands, cargo lost, families destroyed. They knew what the U-boats had done to the convoys, to their navy, to their country. They were not inclined to let this one escape. In the forward gun mounts, the crews sat in their positions, hands on training wheels, waiting for a target. In the engine rooms, the machinists' mates watched their gauges, nursing the old boilers through the endless chase. In the pilot house, the helmsman held the wheel steady against the swells, responding to course changes that came faster and faster as the radar operators tracked the elusive contact. At 01:57, nearly 4 hours after the initial contact, Borie's radar finally painted a stable return. Bearing 340. Range 2,000 yards. Strong and consistent, not fading in and out like the ghost contacts that had tormented them all night. The submarine had surfaced to run on diesel engines and recharge its batteries, gambling that the darkness and the weather would hide it long enough to replenish its nearly exhausted power reserves. It was a gamble that submarines had to take. Running submerged on battery, power drained the cells within hours. But without surfacing to charge, the boat would eventually lose all power, unable to dive, unable to run, a helpless target. But surfacing meant vulnerability. It meant radar detection. It meant being caught. Hutchins snapped the order, General Quarters. The alarm gonged through the ship, penetrating every compartment, waking every man who had managed to fall asleep at his station. Feet pounded on ladder treads, hatches slammed. The gun crews threw off their weather covers and trained their weapons toward the bearing. Hutchins ordered the searchlight. His gunnery officer trained the forward 4-inch guns on the bearing. The 24-inch searchlight swung toward the contact, its operator ready to illuminate whatever was out there in the darkness. The light snapped on, and there was U-405. She was a Type 7C submarine, the workhorse of the German submarine fleet, 220 feet long, displacing 769 tons on the surface. Her pressure hull was thick steel, designed to withstand depth charges at depths that would crush an ordinary vessel. She carried 5 torpedo tubes, 4 forward and 1 aft, and an 88mm deck gun that could engage surface targets at ranges of several miles. On her conning tower and winter garden deck were mounted various anti-aircraft weapons. Twin 20mm guns in powered mounts, single machine guns on pintle stands. She had departed her base at Brest, France, 3 weeks earlier, bound for patrol station in the North Atlantic. Her captain had orders to attack any westbound convoy he encountered, to disrupt the flow of supplies that was keeping Britain alive. She had not found a convoy. She had spent weeks submerged during daylight, surfacing only at night to charge her batteries, always alert for the aircraft that now seemed to be everywhere. Her commander was Korvettenkapitan Rolf Heinrich Hauptmann. Hauptmann was 32 years old, a career naval officer who had transferred to the submarine service early in the war. He had completed 4 war patrols, surviving when so many of his comrades had not. He had sunk 3 Allied ships totaling over 18,000 tons, a respectable record that had earned him the Iron Cross First Class and the respect of his crew. He had been depth-charged twice, attacks that had killed men in the compartments around him, that had buckled his boat's hull plates and filled the interior with the screams of metal under pressure. He knew his business. He knew the odds. He knew that every patrol he completed was a gift, that the survival rate for U-boat crews was dropping month by month, that the day was coming when he would dive and not come back up. In the frozen instant when the searchlight found his boat, when the darkness exploded into blinding white glare, Hauptmann had a decision to make. He could dive. Try to escape into the depths, where the destroyer's guns could not reach him. But diving took time, perhaps 90 seconds to clear the bridge, seal the hatches, flood the ballast tanks, and get below the surface. In those 90 seconds, the American guns would be firing. A single hit on the pressure hull could be fatal. A hit on the conning tower could trap him on the surface, or he could fight. The anti-aircraft guns were designed to engage aircraft, but they worked just as well against surface targets. 20-millimeter shells at close range could shred a destroyer's bridge, kill her officers, disable her fire control. If he could get lucky, if he could land enough hits, he might blind the enemy long enough to escape. Hauptmann ordered his gun crews to man the deck weapons. He called for flank speed. He turned toward the destroyer, not away from it, hoping to present the smallest possible target while closing to a range where his smaller weapons might find their mark. It was a bold decision. It was desperate. It was almost certainly a mistake. But there was no time for second-guessing. The guns were already firing. The battle that followed would last approximately 70 minutes. Both commanders would later describe it as the most intense combat experience of their lives. Both ships would fire every weapon they had, and both ships would end up sinking. The first salvos from Borey's 4-inch guns roared across the water at 02:15. The range was less than 400 yards, closing fast. At that distance, even the old destroyer's antiquated fire control could hardly miss. The gun crews worked with desperate efficiency, ramming shells into breaches, stepping clear of the recoil, loading again. Muzzle flashes lit the night like lightning, frozen moments of orange brilliance that left afterimages burning on every observer's retinas. Shells slammed into the water around the submarine, sending up geysers of spray that glittered in the searchlight beam. The near misses hammered the U-boat's hull with pressure waves, staggering the men on deck. And then the gunners found the range. One shell struck the U-boat's deck just forward of the conning tower, blasting a crater in the teak planking and shredding the jumping wire that ran from bow to stern. A second shell hit the Winter Garden, the raised anti-aircraft platform behind the conning tower, killing 2 German sailors instantly and sending their bodies tumbling into the sea. A third exploded against the base of the periscope housing, spraying fragments of steel into the bridge. But U-405 was shooting back. Her 20-millimeter anti-aircraft guns hammered at the destroyer's bridge and superstructure. The muzzle velocity was lower than the American 4-inch weapons, but the rate of fire was vastly higher. Tracers crossed in the darkness, red and white streaks crisscrossing above the churning water like an insane light show. The shells walked across Borey's hull, sparking off steel plates, smashing through exposed equipment, shattering portholes and gauge faces. German machine gun bullets sparked off Borey's bridge wing, punching through the canvas weather dodgers, ricocheting off the director platform. A signalman standing near the flag bag took a round through the forearm and dropped to the deck, clutching the wound. A talker on the fire control phone had his helmet knocked off by a grazing hit that left a furrow across his scalp. Hutchins held his course. He was trying to position for a depth charge attack, trying to cross the submarine's stern where he could roll charges onto her submerged hull. If he could get into the right position, if he could drop a pattern directly on top of the U-boat, the explosions would crush her pressure hull and end the fight in seconds. But the seas were too rough, the distances too short, the closing speed too fast. Both ships were making radical maneuvers, trying to bring weapons to bear while avoiding the enemy's fire. The submarine twisted left, then right, her rudder slamming over as Hauptmann tried to keep his narrow bow pointed at the destroyer. Borey curved through the swells, spray flying from her bow, her gunners trying to track a target that kept disappearing behind waves. The searchlight operator struggled to keep the beam on the submarine. Every time a wave lifted Borey's bow, the light would swing skyward, momentarily blinding the gun crews. Every time the bow dropped, the light would dip into the water, creating a useless pool of green-white illumination. At approximately 02:20, the situation became something no one had planned for. A massive wave, taller than the others, lifted Borey's bow just as Hutchins was maneuvering for a depth charge run. The destroyer surged forward, slightly out of control, her screws biting into water that suddenly wasn't there as the stern rose. At the same instant, U-405 turned sharply to port, Hauptmann trying to bring his stern tube to bear for a desperation torpedo shot. The timing was catastrophic. The destroyer's bow struck the submarine's aft deck. Not a glancing blow, not a near miss, a direct, grinding, crushing impact just behind the conning tower, where the pressure hull curved down toward the stern. The momentum of 1,260 tons of destroyer, moving at 15 knots, drove Borey's bow over the submarine's hull. Metal shrieked, a sound like nothing else on Earth, the scream of steel that never expected to meet steel this way. The U-boat's outer casing crumpled. The destroyer's bow plates buckled. The impact threw men on both vessels off their feet, and then, as another wave lifted the entangled vessels, Borey's bow slid further across the submarine's deck until the destroyer was wedged at an angle, her forward hull resting on top of the U-boat, her stern hanging in the water, the two ships locked together like fingers interlaced. They were wedged for a moment, perhaps 5 or 10 seconds. There was something like silence, just the howling wind, the crashing waves, the groaning of stressed metal. German and American sailors stared at each other across distances measured in feet. Not yards, close enough to see faces, close enough to see fear and rage and confusion, close enough to hear breathing. 20 feet separated the men on Borey's bow from the men on U-405's deck, 20 feet in a war that had already killed millions. Then, someone fired a shot. The close-range firefight that followed would become legend in the destroyer navy, a story passed from wardroom to wardroom, from chief's quarters to mess deck, growing more incredible with each retelling, except it was true. It was all true. Borey's deck crew had trained for gunnery against surface targets at normal naval ranges, hundreds or thousands of yards. They had trained for depth charge attacks against submerged submarines. They had trained for anti-aircraft defense against diving bombers and torpedo planes. They had never trained for this. No one had trained for this. Nothing in naval doctrine, nothing in the tactical manuals, nothing in any war game or training exercise had prepared them for what was happening now. The forward 4-inch guns could not depress low enough to hit the submarine wedged beneath them. The geometry was impossible. The barrels could angle down perhaps 10 degrees, but the U-boat was directly below the muzzles, its deck nearly touching Borey's crumpled bow. Firing the main battery would achieve nothing but noise. So the crews abandoned the main battery and grabbed whatever weapons they could find. Thompson's submachine guns appeared from the ship's armory, .45 caliber weapons that the Navy had purchased for boarding parties and shore patrol. Enlisted men who had never fired the Thompsons in combat now crouched behind Borey's rail, blazing away at German sailors barely 20 feet away. The weapons kicked in their hands, spent brass arcing into the night, bullets sparking off the U-boat's conning tower. Officers produced their sidearms, .45 caliber pistols that were more symbolic than practical under normal circumstances. Lieutenant Morrison Brown emptied his magazine at a German sailor trying to reach the twin 20 mount, then ducked behind a ventilator as return fire crackled overhead. Ensign Warren Perry fired his pistol with one hand while clutching a rail's stanchion with the other, the ship rolling under his feet, impossible to aim, impossible not to try. Rifles aboard Springfield bolt actions that had been aboard since the last war, kept in a locker for reasons no one could quite remember. A gunner's mate named Henderson worked the bolt with mechanical precision, firing, ejecting, loading, firing again, taking down a German who was trying to deploy a machine gun from the Winter Garden. One petty officer, a second-class boatswain's mate, whose name was recorded as Cronin in the after-action reports, emerged from the galley carrying a shotgun used for shark watch during underway replenishments. He fired both barrels at a German officer on the conning tower, reloaded with shells from his dungaree pockets, and fired again. The Germans were equally desperate and equally improvised. Their deck gun was useless, its crew dead or scattered by the collision. The 88mm weapon stood silent, its barrel pointing uselessly at the dark sky. But they had machine pistols, MP-40s that German sailors called, quote, "2, capable of spitting out 500 rounds per minute. They had Lugers and Walther pistols. They had their determination not to be killed without a fight. Men fired at point-blank range across the gap between the locked vessels. American tracers slammed into the conning tower, chipping paint, holding thin steel, ricocheting into the night. German bullets sparked off Borey's hull, punching through ventilators, smashing searchlight lenses. A German sailor crawled toward one of the anti-aircraft positions, his legs kicking against the wet deck. An American seaman shot him before he reached it, and the bodies slid into the gap between the vessels and disappeared. A Borey machinist's mate named Wenz, leaning over the rail with a rifle, took a bullet through the shoulder. He dropped the rifle, grabbed his wound, then picked up the rifle with his good hand and kept firing, bracing the stock against the rail instead of his shattered shoulder. The chief boatswain's mate, Walter Kurtz, would later describe running out of conventional weapons and throwing empty 4-inch shell casings at the German sailors on the submarine's deck. The casings weighed approximately 6 pounds each. At 10 feet, thrown overhand, they were deadly. Kurtz hit one German in the face and sent him sprawling. He hit another in the chest, doubling the man over. He ran out of casings and started throwing whatever else he could find. A tin cup, a fire extinguisher bracket, a piece of the shattered searchlight housing. Lieutenant Philip Brown, the gunnery officer, organized a party of men to fire down into the submarine's open hatches. The conning tower hatch was still open, Germans trying to escape or man weapons tumbling in and out. Brown's men poured fire through the opening, the bullets ricocheting off the interior steel, making the inside of the conning tower a death trap. When they ran low on ammunition, they began dropping depth charges by hand. Small 100-pound charges designed to be rolled off the stern were now lifted by teams of sailors and thrown over the rail onto the U-boat's deck. The charges were not armed for immediate detonation, their hydrostatic pistols set for depths the submarine would never reach tonight. They simply smashed into the submarine's structure, denting plates, injuring sailors, adding to the chaos. One charge struck the base of the deck gun, cracking the training mechanism. Another bounced off the conning tower and rolled into the sea, sinking uselessly into the depths. The most remarkable act of the battle came from a seaman named Richard Browner. Browner was 19 years old, a seaman second class from somewhere in the Midwest, one of those boys who had joined the Navy to see the world and found himself instead in the freezing North Atlantic, fighting a war that seemed determined to kill him. He had been firing a Thompson from behind a depth charge rack, burning through magazine after magazine when the weapon jammed. In the chaos of the battle, with bullets cracking overhead and shells exploding and men screaming on both ships, most sailors would have dropped the jammed weapon and found another, or simply taken cover until the situation changed. Browner grabbed his sheath knife and jumped. He leaped across the gap between the vessels, landing on the submarine's slippery deck, 4 feet below Borey's rail. His feet hit the casing and slipped, and he went down on one knee, steadying himself against the deck gun pedestal. A German sailor materializing out of the chaos lunged toward him. Browner killed the German with the knife. It was close, brutal, intimate, the kind of combat that belonged to another century, to boarding actions and pirate battles, not to modern warfare with its radar and radio and carefully calculated firing solutions. In the confusion of spray and gunfire and darkness, Browner stabbed the German and then scrambled back toward Borey, grabbing a line that someone had thrown down, climbing hand over hand up the destroyer's hull while bullets sparked off the steel around him. He made it. He rolled over the rail and crawled behind a ventilator, his knife still in his hand, blood on the blade that wasn't his. The war had produced many acts of courage. This one was almost pathologically aggressive. Browner would receive the Navy Cross, the second highest award for valor the Navy could bestow. His citation would describe the action in dry, bureaucratic language that utterly failed to capture what it had been like, what it had taken, what it meant. He was 19 years old. After approximately 15 minutes of this insane melee, the sea finally intervened. A particularly violent wave, larger than the others, swept across both vessels. It lifted Borey's stern, the screws coming out of the water with a chattering whine, and then dropped it, the entire 1,000-ton ship lurching downward. The motion wrenched the locked vessels with tremendous force. Metal screamed as the destroyer's crumpled bow tore free of the submarine's deck, pulling with it fragments of U-405's outer casing. Both ships lurched away from each other, staggering like boxers after a clinch. The sudden separation threw men off their feet on both vessels. The gap widened from 5 feet to 10 to 20 to 50, the churning water filling the space between them. But the fight was not over. The vessels separated by perhaps 50 yards, still within easy range of each other's weapons. Hutchins, recovering from the shock of the separation, assessed the situation in seconds. The submarine was still afloat. Her crew was still fighting. The job was not done. He ordered his remaining operable guns to re-engage. The after 4-inch mounts, which had been unable to bear during the ramming, now had clear fields of fire. Gun captains swung their weapons toward the target. Pointer and trainer matched their dials. The order came, commence firing. The guns opened up at point-blank range. Shells slammed into U-405's conning tower. The already damaged structure buckled under the impacts, steel plates folding inward like paper. Her hull plates buckled. Fires broke out along her deck, diesel fuel igniting where ruptured tanks met friction sparks. German sailors who had survived 4 years of the most dangerous service in any navy were cut down in seconds, their bodies tumbling into the freezing water or crumpling against their own deck equipment. The submarine tried to run. Her diesels coughed to life, thick exhaust pouring from her stern, and she began to pull away. But she was wounded, her rudder damaged, her hull holed below the waterline. She could barely make 5 knots, and even that was costing her the last of her reserves. Borey followed, her own engines straining, her damaged bow pushing through the swells with agonizing slowness. The gun crews kept firing, walking their shells along the submarine's deck, hitting the pressure hull again and again. Hauptmann, the submarine commander, was still alive in the conning tower. He had survived the ramming, survived the firefight, survived the shelling. His boat was dying around him, but he was still giving orders, still trying to save what could be saved. He knew the boat was doomed. The flooding was spreading. The diesels were faltering. She would sink within the hour, maybe less. The question now was whether any of his crew would survive the night. At approximately 03:15, Hauptmann ordered abandon ship. German sailors began pouring out of the hatches, jumping into the North Atlantic swells. The water temperature was approximately 42 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill an unprotected man in 20 minutes. Some had life jackets, many did not. They jumped anyway, because the alternative was burning or drowning inside a sinking steel coffin. Borey ceased fire. Hutchins ordered his crew to stand down from the main battery and prepare for rescue operations. The shooting was over. At approximately 03:30, U-405 began her final dive, not a controlled descent to escape depth, but the fatal slide of a vessel too damaged to stay afloat. Her bow dipped first, water pouring through the shell holes in her forward section. The angle steepened, her stern rose, propellers still slowly turning in the air, still receiving power from engines that did not know the ship was dying. She slid beneath the waves with a sound like a long exhalation, the air escaping her compartments bubbling to the surface in a great roil of foam. She would sink to the bottom nearly 3 miles below, taking with her the bodies of her dead, the secrets of her patrol, the dreams of men who would never see Germany again. Of her crew of 54 men, roughly 30 had made it into the water. The rest had died in the fighting or gone down with their boat. Borey had killed her enemy, but the victory had cost her everything. The destroyer was in desperate condition. Her bow plates were crumpled from the collision, taking on water faster than the pumps could handle. Her forward compartments were flooding steadily, the frames groaning under the weight of water they were never designed to hold. Several of her crew were dead or wounded from the gun battle, their bodies laid out on the mess deck or being treated by the pharmacist's mate in the crowded sick bay, And her engines, those elderly temperamental engines that had somehow carried her through 4 hours of pursuit and 70 minutes of combat, were failing. Hutchins summoned his damage control officer for a report. The news was not good. Flooding in 3 forward compartments. The collision bulkhead was holding, but barely. Rivets weeping water at half the seams. If it gave way, the ship would sink within minutes. The forward fire room was taking water from shell holes and stressed hull plates. The water level rising despite the pumps. At least 2 of the boilers were offline, their tubes cracked, their steam pressure falling. Maximum achievable speed was perhaps 12 knots, and even that was optimistic. Meanwhile, the weather was worsening. The swells that had been 20 feet during the battle were now approaching 30. The wind was gusting to 40 knots. The ship was pitching and rolling in ways that stressed the damaged hull still further, and dawn was still hours away. Hutchins had a choice to make. He could try to rescue the German survivors in the water, the laws of the sea, the traditions of naval warfare, the basic humanity that distinguished combatants from murderers, all demanded that he try to save men who would otherwise freeze to death, but doing so would require slowing his damaged ship in dangerous conditions, maneuvering close to men who had been shooting at him 30 minutes earlier, diverting crew and equipment from damage control to rescue operations. Or he could focus on saving his own crew and run for the carrier group. Leave the Germans to their fate. They were the enemy. They had been trying to kill him hours earlier. They had been sinking Allied ships for 4 years. He chose humanity. Borie circled the debris field, her searchlight playing across the water, illuminating the heads of swimming men, the clusters of survivors clinging to wreckage. Her crew threw lines and life rings over the side, reaching down to grasp slippery hands, hauling exhausted Germans up out of the killing cold. The men who climbed aboard wore the same fear in their eyes that Borie's crew felt. They were shivering, gasping, barely able to stand. Many had been wounded in the fighting. All were in shock. Minutes earlier, they had been shooting at the men who were now saving their lives. The rescue took nearly 45 minutes. In the end, they pulled roughly 15 survivors from the water, approximately half of those who had abandoned ship. The rest had drowned or frozen or simply slipped beneath the waves before the searchlight could find them. Among the survivors was Korvettenkapitan Hauptmann. He came aboard near the end of the rescue, hauled up the side by 2 American seamen who did not know they were saving the submarine commander. He was exhausted, hypothermic, his uniform torn and stained with blood that might have been his or might have belonged to his crew. He could barely stand. When he was brought to the bridge to meet Hutchins, the 2 commanders looked at each other without speaking. There was nothing to say. They had tried to kill each other. They had failed. Now they were sharing a dying ship in the middle of an ocean that wanted to kill them both. Hauptmann would survive the night. He would survive the war. He would spend the remainder of the conflict in American prisoner of war camps, then return to Germany and live through the reconstruction and the division and the eventual reunification of his country. He would die in 2003. In interviews, decades later, he maintained respect for the American crew that had captured him. He described Hutchins and his men as brave enemies who had fought well and then shown mercy when they had no obligation to do so. It was, in the strange arithmetic of naval combat, a kind of mutual respect that only men who have tried to kill each other can understand. But mercy had cost time, and time was running out. By dawn on November 1st, Borie was wallowing in heavy seas, her forward compartments nearly awash, her remaining engines struggling to maintain steerage way. The bow sat lower than it should have, waves breaking over the forecastle where they had never reached before. The list was worsening as water found its way into compartments that damage control could not reach. Hutchins sent a distress signal to the card group. Help was coming, but it was hours away. The escort carrier and her remaining destroyers were making best speed toward Borie's position, but best speed was limited by the weather and the need to maintain formation. They would not arrive until early afternoon. That left Borey alone, fighting the sea, fighting the damage, fighting time. The crew worked through the morning in conditions that ranged from difficult to nightmarish. Damage control parties shored up bulkheads with timber and mattresses, trying to reinforce the collision bulkhead that was all that stood between the forward compartments and flooding that would kill the ship. Pump crews worked the portable submersibles until the motors burned out, then switched to manual handybillies, pumping by muscle power alone. Men worked in flooded compartments with water to their chests, in freezing temperatures that numbed hands and slowed thoughts, trying to plug leaks that kept appearing faster than they could patch them. The galley crew kept the coffee coming. Pots brewed and rebrewed until the liquid was barely distinguishable from ballast water. There was no hot food. The stoves had been secured when the forward compartments started flooding. Men ate sandwiches of cold bread and colder meat, chewing mechanically, their minds elsewhere. The wounded were crowded into the after-berthing compartments, laid out on bunks and deck space, tended by the pharmacist's mate and anyone else who could be spared. Some were serious, a seaman with a bullet through his lung, breathing blood bubbles, probably not going to make it. A petty officer with shrapnel in his abdomen, screaming when anyone touched him, probably not going to make it either. Others would survive if they could be gotten to proper medical care, if the ship could stay afloat long enough. The German prisoners were gathered in the aft crew's mess, guarded by armed sailors who looked almost as exhausted as their charges. The Germans sat in silence, wrapped in blankets borrowed from Borey's crew, drinking coffee that their captors could have used themselves. They were enemies. They were also sailors. They understood what was happening, what the sounds of pumps and shouting meant, what the increasing list signified. Every hour brought new reports, none of them good. The forward engine room was taking water. The remaining boilers were fluctuating, steam pressure dropping as salt water contaminated the feedwater system. The collision bulkhead was bowing inward, the pressure of accumulated water pushing against steel that had never been designed for this kind of stress. Maximum speed was now 8 knots, then 6, then 4. By noon, Hutchins knew the ship was dying. The flooding had spread beyond the damage control party's ability to contain it. The forward spaces were awash. The collision bulkhead was developing hairline cracks. The main engines were operating on borrowed time. He calculated the odds, the distances, the time remaining. Even if the pumps kept working at maximum capacity, even if the bulkheads held, even if the engines kept running, the ship would founder within hours. At 13:30, he made the decision no captain wants to make. He ordered abandoned ship. The process took nearly 2 hours. It was not a panicked evacuation. It was organized, methodical, conducted by men who had trained for this moment, even though they had never expected to face it. Borey's crew assembled on the tilting deck, organized by division, wearing life jackets and Mae Wests. The wounded were loaded into life rafts first, lowered over the side on falls and lines, the men fortunate enough to be conscious gripping the raft lines with desperate strength. The German prisoners went next, still guarded, still under nominal detention, but helped over the side by the same Americans who had been killing their crewmates hours before. Then, the rest of the crew went over the side. They jumped into the North Atlantic, into water that seemed designed to kill them. The cold was beyond description, beyond imagination, beyond anything their California or Texas or Tennessee experience had prepared them for. It squeezed their chests. It stopped their hearts for an instant before the adrenaline kicked in. It told them in no uncertain terms that they had minutes, not hours, to get out of this water or die in it. They swam toward the rafts. They clung to wreckage. They helped each other, held each other up, kicked toward anything that floated. Hutchins was the last man to leave. He stood on the fantail of his dying ship, watching her bow disappear beneath the swells, watching the waves wash over the gun mounts and depth charge racks, watching 23 years of naval history slip toward the bottom. He had been her captain for 6 months. He would remember those 6 months, and this final hour for the rest of his life. Then he dropped into the Atlantic. The water was so cold, it felt like being stabbed. The destroyer, Borie, another veteran four-piper from the Card Group, had been racing toward Borey's position since dawn. She arrived alongside the debris field within the hour after Hutchins gave the order to abandon ship. Her crew, working with frantic efficiency, began pulling survivors from the water. The process was brutal and urgent. Men could not survive long in those temperatures. Every minute in the water was another percentage point added to hypothermia risk, another step toward the cold-induced cardiac arrest that would kill them as surely as any German weapon. Borey's crew threw lines, deployed scramble nets, dragged men over the rail by any means possible. They hauled up Americans and Germans alike, not distinguishing between them in the urgency of the moment. They wrapped the survivors in blankets, poured hot coffee into shaking hands, carried the worst cases below to the sick bay. 127 men were rescued. 27 more had died, either in the battle or in the hours afterward. Some had been killed by German fire, some had drowned when their compartments flooded, some had simply succumbed to cold and exhaustion while waiting for rescue. Their bodies were not recovered. The sea kept them. Borie slipped beneath the waves late on the afternoon of November 1st, 1943. She sank approximately 600 miles southwest of Iceland, in waters slightly over 3 miles deep. She had been in commission for 23 years. She had served in 2 world wars. She had crossed the Atlantic more times than anyone had counted, and in the end, she had killed her enemy and died with him. There would be no return to port for repair, no dry dock where welders could patch her wounds, no crew that would ever serve aboard her again. She was gone, joining the thousands of other ships that the Atlantic had claimed over the centuries, becoming part of the graveyard that stretched from America to Europe. The aftermath of the battle played out in briefing rooms and award ceremonies far from the freezing North Atlantic. Shaky Commander Hutchins was awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest award for valor in naval combat. His citations specifically mentioned the ramming and the close-quarters gun battle, events that seemed to belong to an earlier age of warfare. He was also awarded command of a new destroyer, one of the modern Fletcher-class ships that were winning the war in the Pacific. It was a vote of confidence from a Navy that recognized what he had done, what his crew had accomplished, what it all meant. Multiple members of his crew received Silver Stars and Navy Crosses. Seaman Browner's knife fight became a story told in destroyer wardrooms for decades, the kind of tale that grew bigger with each telling but never quite exceeded the documented truth. The men who survived the battle would carry it with them for the rest of their lives, a reference point against which every subsequent experience would be measured. The U-boat war continued, brutal and grinding for another 18 months. U-405 was one of 237 German submarines lost in 1943 alone, a staggering attrition rate that the Kriegsmarine could not sustain. The trained commanders, the experienced crews, the irreplaceable petty officers who kept the boats running, were dying faster than Germany could replace them. By the war's end, over 700 U-boats would be destroyed, taking more than 28,000 German sailors to their deaths, a casualty rate of over 75%. No major military force in modern history has suffered proportional losses that severe. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost heavily. The German Luftwaffe was decimated, but the U-boat force took casualties that surpassed them all, a percentage of men killed that more closely resembled the mass slaughters of the First World War than anything experienced in the Second. The men who served aboard those submarines knew the odds. They went anyway. Some were driven by duty, some by ideology, some by the momentum of a war that gave them no other choice. But they went and they died, and their graves stretched from the Arctic to the South Atlantic, to the coasts of America itself. It did not save Germany. The convoy routes stayed open. The supplies flowed. Britain did not starve. The invasion of Europe became possible, then inevitable, then accomplished. The 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years and change, buried under the rubble of its own ambitions. And for all the technological sophistication of the radar and sonar and depth charges that won the Battle of the Atlantic, sometimes victory came down to something much simpler and much older. It came down to men willing to ram their ship into an enemy and fight hand to hand across the grinding metal, to throw shell casings when the bullets ran out, to jump onto an enemy deck with nothing but a knife. The lesson of the Borie and the U-405 is not a comfortable one. It is not a lesson about technology winning wars. The radar and depth charges and aircraft that were supposed to give the Allies decisive advantage failed to prevent close-quarters combat with weapons that would have been familiar to pirates 3 centuries earlier. Technology is a tool. It does not replace human courage. It does not substitute for the willingness to fight. It is not a lesson about superior tactics. The tactical manuals, the doctrine, the careful plans that naval officers study and memorize became useless the moment the ships collided. What followed was improvisation, desperation, reactions shaped by instinct and training and fear. The survivors would have been hard-pressed to describe a plan in any meaningful sense. They did what they had to do to kill the enemy before the enemy killed them. It is not a lesson about the inevitable triumph of industrial production. The Borie was gone. A ship that had taken a year to build, that had served for over 2 decades, that required 163 men to operate, had been exchanged for 1 submarine. The arithmetic of attrition favored the Allies eventually, but the cost was paid in men who did not come home and ships that would not sail again. The lesson is about what happens when all of that fails. When the machines break down and the doctrine proves inadequate, and there is nothing left but human beings and their willingness to fight. When the chips are down and the ammunition is low and the situation is impossible. When the only options are victory or death, and victory requires something that no training manual covers. On a night in November 1943, 2 crews reached that point. They fought with everything they had until both of their ships were dying. They improvised weapons from whatever was at hand. They jumped onto enemy decks with knives. They threw hell at each other across 20 feet of Atlantic darkness, and both sides bled, and both sides died, and in the end, both ships went to the bottom. And then, when it was over, the survivors reached into the water and pulled each other out. That is the part of the story that the official records struggle to capture. The same men who had been trying to kill each other helped each other survive. American sailors who had watched their shipmates die saved German sailors who had been shooting at them. German sailors accepted rescue from the hands that had nearly killed them. There is something in that exchange that transcends the politics, the ideologies, the national hatreds that started the war. Something that suggests that beneath the uniforms and the flags and the orders from distant capitals, the men on both sides recognized something in each other. They were sailors. They were fighting men. They understood what it meant to be on a sinking ship in the middle of an ocean that didn't care about their politics. Charles Hutchins survived the war. He retired from the Navy as a captain, spending the remainder of his career in increasingly responsible positions, never quite matching the intensity of that one night in November 43. He lived until 1991, long enough to see the Cold War end and a new world emerge from the old. He rarely spoke about the battle in public. When asked about it privately, he would say simply that his men had done what they had to do. That was all he would say. It was enough. Rolf Heinrich Hauptmann also survived. He spent the remainder of the war in American prisoner of war camps, then returned to Germany and lived through the reconstruction and the division and the eventual reunification of his country. He died in 2003, one of the last U-boat commanders of his generation. In interviews, he maintained respect for the American crew that had captured him and gratitude for the rescue they had risked their own safety to perform. He never expressed regret for his service. He never apologized for doing his duty. He simply survived and remembered, and eventually passed from the world, as all survivors eventually do. There were no villains in this battle, only men doing what their nations asked of them, in conditions that should have been impossible, with weapons that ranged from radar to sheath knives. Every year, the anniversary of the battle passes without much notice. November 1st is not a day of commemoration in either the American or German navies. No ceremonies are held, no speeches are given. The men who fought that night are almost all gone now, carried off by time rather than torpedoes. Soon, there will be no one left who remembers what it felt like to fire a Thompson at point-blank range while the ship ground against the enemy's hull. No one who remembers the screaming metal and the freezing spray and the certainty that death was seconds away. But the record remains. Somewhere in the naval archives, in yellowed folders and digitized documents, are the reports and recommendations and award citations that tried to capture what happened. Somewhere in family collections are letters and photographs and medals that belong to men who jumped into freezing water to save enemies who had been shooting at them minutes earlier. Somewhere in the memories still held by the few remaining survivors, the images persist, sharp-edged and brutal, refusing to fade. The wreck of the Borey has never been found. 3 miles is a long way down, the pressure unimaginable, the darkness absolute. Modern technology could probably locate her if someone cared enough to look. But no one has. The North Atlantic keeps her secrets well. But somewhere on the bottom, within a few miles of each other, rests the remains of 2 warships that killed each other in probably the most savage surface engagement of the entire campaign. U-405 lies in pieces, her pressure hull crushed by the depths she was designed to visit but not to stay. The steel that protected her from the enemy's weapons offered no defense against the weight of the ocean above. Her crew's remains are entombed within, or scattered across the seabed, or dissolved into the chemistry of the deep. The sea took everything. Borey lies nearby, her hull broken by the impact of hitting bottom at terminal velocity, her guns still pointing toward an enemy ship that no longer exists. The years have softened her outlines, rust and microbial decay eating away at the steel, turning her slowly into a reef, a habitat, a memorial that no one visits. The 2 vessels fought for barely an hour. They will share that patch of seafloor for eternity. And we remember. We remember not because remembering changes anything, not because memory can bring back the dead or heal the wounds or undo the damage. We remember because that is what the living owe the dead. We remember because the story matters, because the choices those men made under impossible circumstances reveal something about what human beings are capable of, for good and for ill. We remember the ramming, the grinding impact of coal against hull, the surreal impossibility of 2 warships locked together while their crews shot at each other from distances measured in feet. We remember the improvisation, the shell casings thrown like rocks, the depth charges dropped by hand, the knife fight on the submarine's deck. We remember the courage, the men who stood their ground when running would have been understandable, the officers who made decisions that cost them their ship but saved their crew, the sailors who jumped into freezing water to rescue enemies they had been trying to kill minutes earlier. We remember the humanity, the rescue of survivors from both sides, the coffee shared in the mess deck, the mutual respect that emerged from mutual terror. That is the story of the ramming of U-405. It is a story about war at its most brutal, combat reduced to its most primitive elements, technology stripped away until nothing remained but human beings and their willingness to fight. It is also a story about mercy, surviving in places where you would least expect to find it, about enemies recognizing enemies as fellow human beings, about the laws of the sea, holding even when everything else had broken down. Both ships are gone now. Their crews have followed. The sea has closed over everything, leaving no trace of the blood and the fire and the desperate courage of that night. But we remember, that is all the dead can ask. That is all the living can offer.